This is Closereads.
A philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. We've got a new text, and it is a listener request to go back to Hegel's Phenomenology. We're going to read the section on Stoicism, Scepticism, and the unhappy consciousness that is in the heading above that is freedom of self-consciousness, which is just after the other self-consciousness, the lordship and bondage section that we covered in one of the Partially Examined Life episodes, the most famous part. So this is, I don't know if we technically discussed this part in those episodes, but I think this is probably like where we left off. So if we were going to like continue and read the rest of the book, which we're not going to do because it would take forever, I think this is where we would be. So it is page 119 in the Peach text, the Findley, or 155 on the PDF that we will link folks to. Do you have any fond memories of this?
No. I don't. You know, I can say about the lordship and bondage section that in a semi-joking way that one aspect of the bondage, right, is it's about caring what other people think of you, which is not a very freeing position. So in an honor society, right, you'd be bonded by conceptions of status, and it's the sort of recognition you seek. And the higher level of recognition is reciprocity, right, where you get to something akin to Kantian respect for others and mutual respect, so that what binds ends up being a more universal morality as opposed to more one-sided honor. And you know, people can go back and listen to our first Hegel episode, and where we cover the whole lordship and bondage section. But I think since we're coming out of that, we're starting at the concept of reciprocity, and that in a way is a ground for freedom, right? As the existentialist would say, you respect the part of one's individual freedom is respecting the freedom of others.
Right. I know from previously looking at this that, you know, this is not going to be a nuanced consideration of skeptical ethics or anything, or Stoic ethics. We know in general that he's dismissive of skepticism, that he has a sort of doubt the doubt approach. That's right from the beginning of the phenomenology, that he doesn't see like the Cartesian point as the natural starting point of philosophy. Like, why would you think that you could doubt everything? By, you know, we're in a situation, etc. But here we're talking almost, well, I want to say psychologically, but it gets to the point of ontologically, like what establishes something as a self. Well, it's because you have other people that are reflecting something back at you. And we've talked about this more than as much as any other topic in the history of the Partially Examined Life, of all the different variations and reactions that people have to this. In the recording just last night that I participated in, that you were on vacation for, Wes, we were talking about Irigaray and her claims that male-female relations should be like a prime way, you know, you and your mother, and then husband and wife, people in relationships, that people bounce off each other, that people see themselves. But if women are not treated as subjects, if they're essentially just like, I'm just a raw mirror, I just want to bounce my ideas off my wife using her as another person, and then it's just this narcissistic thing, and you don't really get.
That's what mommy is for.
Yes. Well,
Problem with being a mother.
Babies don't know better. People, adults in relationships, men should know better. And hopefully, you know, you have a reciprocal relationship that you're
femininity,
not doing that.
Yeah. Femininity in part relies on signifiers of maternality, and it's built into, I think, attraction. Anyway, so I would make an argument that it's more than social, obviously, and it has to be overcome to the extent that it makes people unhappy. But yeah, let's not talk about that. Let's get into it.
So it's
Yeah.
section 197. Please proceed, Wes.
For the independent self consciousness, it is only the pure abstraction of the I that is its essential nature. And when it does develop its own differences, this differentiation does not become a nature that is objective and intrinsic to it. Thus, this self
Ooh.
consciousness does not become an I that, in its simplicity, is genuinely self differentiating, or that, in this absolute differentiation, remains identical with itself.
I feel like this is going to be a book where we do not want to read a whole section.
No, no, let's
So
just
let
leave it there. It's if you read too little, then you miss out on later context that could be helpful. But yeah, no, in this case, we better just get in after two sentences.
yeah, the whole
Um,
arc of the chapter prior to this is that the I in its simplicity is something that is entirely contentless. And it is that sort of Cartesian point of there is thinking going on, but you're not like thinking of yourselves as having qualities. You're not actually distinguished from any other I. Everybody who's in that phenomenological position of self-consideration is encountering the same thing. There's no meat on the bones. So it's only when you get in a social context that you can display behaviors to other people and people are like, "Hey, you're one of those people who's kind of like that." You know, so that what makes me distinctly me? So, yes,
yeah,
in its simplicity it is not genuinely self-differentiating.
yeah. I think part of this, one way to say this is that the differentiation has a social aspect to it. So our internal differentiation relies on this dynamic of mirroring and reflection from others and the internalization of fantasies of that kind of recognition from others. If you were put it in psychoanalytic or psychological development mental terms, it means that we perform identifications developmentally. You can think of this developmentally as people get older and start to get more interesting, right? As children start to develop identities, they do that in a way by sucking in identity from their environment. So they can identify with parents, they can identify with cultural values. A lot of what we think of as conscience and moral prohibition or aspiration I want to be this, I want to be that, relies on identification. So that's an example, a very typical Hegelian example of internal differentiation being the product of external relations. That's something that just doesn't happen to the
Hmm.
Cartesian abstract I by itself. It's not self-differentiating in that way. That's my guess at what's going on here. We'll see. I think that was following on what you were just saying.
Yep. Uh, right. So, thus, the self consciousness does not become an I that in its simplicity is genuinely self differentiating. On the other hand, the consciousness that is forced back into itself becomes, in its formative activity, its own object in the form of a thing it has fashioned, and at the same time sees in the Lord a consciousness that exists as being for self. So remember the Lord is in the lordship and bondage section is sort of like the man who's treating the woman as an object, right? The Lord doesn't see he likes the recognition, but sees basically the world as unconstrained, whereas the uh, right that the servants uh, every action is just an extension of the Lord's will, whereas the servant, the bondsman, actually gets the better deal out of it in terms of forming a self because I'm pushing back against something. I'm willing something, but the Lord won't let me do that. So I actually have a very clear sense of like what is me and what is not me.
And also here, right, we think of the bondsman here as the worker.
Yeah.
So when Hegel is talking about formative activity and the thing that it is fashioned, he's really talking about, yeah, making things, or more generally, the effect that one has on the world with one's work and finding, the Marx makes a lot of this, finding one's reflection in that work. So we can get it from more than other people. And in a way, as you were saying, that's a better deal if the work is authentic, right? There's more
Hmm.
authenticity in that than in what you get from the reflection from the Lord. But at the same time, it sees in the Lord a consciousness that exists as being for self. There's a twofold thing going on with the bondsman worker. They're finding a reflection in their own work product, and they're also finding it in the Lord. And the Lord has this appearance of being someone who is exists as being for self, who doesn't depend on this reflection, right? They're completely autonomous in this fantasy. It's like a parent, right? It's the way
Hmm.
children see parents, or for Lacan, it's what you see when you look in the right. Remember the mirror stage, and you see a physical body that seems to be complete and well unified. That's the idea. You see something that's complete and well unified in itself, and you seem to be getting reflection from that. And you could say this, maybe even God, right, serves that kind of purpose.
But for the subservient consciousness as such, these two moments, itself as an independent object, and this object as a mode of consciousness, and hence its own essential nature, fall apart. Since, however, the form and the being for self are for us, or in themselves the same, and since in the notion of independent consciousness, the intrinsic being is consciousness, the moment of intrinsic being or thinghood, which received its form in being fashioned, is no other substance than consciousness.
All right.
That's a mouthful.
Um, let's just start with the first sentence.
Yep.
But for the subservient consciousness as such, these two moments, itself is independent object. Um, its
And this
own
object
object
is
in the
mode of
form of the thing it has
consciousness.
fashioned in the previous sentence.
Hmm.
So there's an independence in that.
Right.
This
I am
object is
not
a,
the thing. I have created a thing. And so I'm distinct from that thing. I'm also distinct from the bondsman, from the Lord.
yeah.
So I'm an independent object, but I'm also a mode. That object is a mode of consciousness that I see myself as subjectivity. I'm not sure exactly what that means.
Um, these two moments itself is an independent. I mean, it sounds like consciousness. Um, right. So I think what this is getting at is the ambiguity, right, that Beauvoir talks about, seeing ourselves from the outside and the inside. The sense of
Hmm.
my independence of consciousness makes it like a thing, like an independent
Yeah,
object. But it's a mode of consciousness in the sense of I'm inside it. I'm a subjectivity. So these two things fall apart, and that, of course, becomes a big problem philosophically. How we can
uh,
be, um, things, material beings, and subjectivities at the same time.
sure. Now we as theorizers, the form and the being for self are for us or in themselves. So in other words, we are as theoreticians coming in and observing what's going on here, and we can see. I mean, we can see that the person who's having this experience, the bondsman, that's actually the same thing. You've created an object of yourself, but it is also your subjective, immediate mode of consciousness. And so for you, maybe you have abstracted those things, you, the person who's undergoing this, but for us or in themselves, they are the same. So, like, as when we're doing a taxonomy of what consciousness is, we're not going to say that fundamentally the mode of consciousness and the object that one creates in making oneself a self, we're not going to say those are separate. So in a sense, they're different. From the inside, they seem different. From the outside, they don't seem different.
Um, yeah, I'm still a little confused. The form and the being for self are for us or in themselves the same, which I was taking initially to be consciousness from the inside and the outside. In the notion of independent consciousness, the intrinsic being is consciousness.
So the
Um,
notion, right, is where is the initial, or it's where it's pointing to.
yeah, the
So
notion
the
is the unfleshed out
yeah,
concept that right, through dialectic gets fleshed out into the full, you know, uh, the um, gets fleshed out in its fullness, and that happens through a dialectical uh, process.
So,
So our kind of primitive or unfleshed out notion of independent consciousness, um, we take it. So in other words, we take it to be its intrinsic being is consciousness, as opposed to what, this relationship to the fashioned object.
as opposed
Um,
to an object at all. I mean, we just see consciousness as an object, like as if you have consciousness as a property. Hey, you are a conscious being. You have consciousness. That's at least when we're not in the actual process of reflecting on our own experience, when we're just looking at somebody else, like, well, that rock is not conscious. That animal, that person is conscious. That's at least what I'm saying, what I'm
hmm.
interpreting that as.
The moment of intrinsic being or thinghood which received its form in being fashioned is no other substance than consciousness. So I'm a little bit confused by the switching back and forth between the product of consciousness and consciousness. Um, thinghood which received its form, okay, right? That's some object that we make in being fashioned, is no other substance than consciousness. Um, I
I
mean,
mean, what else could it
yeah,
be?
is uh,
It's not.
so if we were talking about, right, so Aristotle's metaphysics famously, he wants to draw an analogy between art, objects of, technical art, and biological form. And the priority of form happens in the sense that the concept, right, the notion that we have before we create the object, which is analogous to the genetic blueprint in a biological form, uh, that form is prior. That's form. It's prior, and it's in our minds, and then it gets imprinted on something when we um, make the object. So there's a sense in which um, the substance of consciousness, the form, is transferred into the object. So when we say an axe and it is an axe, right? What is its intrinsic being? What is it that makes it a thing? What is it that makes it a unity? Well, it's something that really is a matter of our tool use, right? There's no axe in itself. It's the substance of it is the teleology that we give it. It's our own consciousness that is imprinted on the world. I don't know. Does that sound right to you?
I mean, that sounds right about Aristotle. So you're saying that the notion here is like the form, that the notion is something that is
It's
prior.
unactualized
It
form, and
is
it gets
right.
actualized in the making of the
Yeah.
object. But um, I'm not. It's unclear to me how the switch back and forth between talk of consciousness and then the object, the product, or the thing that's fashioned, how that works. Since in the notion of independent consciousness, the intrinsic being is consciousness. Um, so he's putting it this like it's a conclusion. The conclusion that he's getting out of this is that the substance of the fashioned thing is consciousness. The
No
premise,
other substance than consciousness. Yep.
yeah, the premise is that um, the idea of independent consciousness is found. The idea is that its substance, its intrinsic being, its substance is consciousness. Um, I'm not sure why he needs that premise here, but maybe we'll find out.
Right, right. And there's two premises for this. Since, however,
Yeah.
the form and being for self are for us or in themselves the same, that's one premise. And the notion of independent consciousness, the intrinsic being is consciousness. Therefore, the moment of intrinsic being or thinghood, which has received its form in being fashion, is no other substance in consciousness. Let's see where he's going with this. We are in the presence of self consciousness in a new shape, a consciousness which, as the infinitude of consciousness, or as its own pure movement, is aware of itself as an essential being, a being which thinks or is a free self consciousness. So
Um,
the dynamic quality, like consciousness is not just a substance, it is this process of reflection, self recognition. It is cyclical, it's a pure movement, and there's a certain freedom that you don't see yourself as mere substance. Like when you recognize, hey, I have made myself an object. I am different than this thing that I've just created. I'm different than the Lord who is limiting my freedom. Uh, that gives me a certain space to still spin, to still seemingly make choices and define myself, right? That this is where the existentialist moment comes in, that you, as you know, Sartre says that there is no by what he had just said in the previous sentence, Hegel just said that the essence of this whole thing is consciousness. It is to say that it is not a particular object with a fixed essence.
yeah, I think one way to think of this is that as we are educated, right, we develop more freedom to think for ourselves, even though education involves a lot of indoctrination, and developmentally, non-formal education, it involves what I've called identification. So, um, right, we were conceiving in Lord and Bondsman, we're conceiving of self-consciousness in terms of this relationship to an other and their recognition of us and our recognition of that. But ultimately, that dyad gets internalized. And, you know, I don't need to be around a person to be self conscious. I obtain some autonomy and freedom from that dyad by internalizing it. And then, the traditional philosophical, the philosophical tradition would say, but also by being reason responsive, right? Also by being able to reason about things. That's where I really take off. That's where the spaceship of freedom really gets going. It's all developmentally founded in social stuff, but it seems to kind of reach a certain kind of escape velocity. So anyway, yeah, we are aware of it becomes self-consciousness becomes aware of itself as essential being. I think as not simply being dependent on this recognition stuff, a being which thinks or is a free. So the thinking there, I think, is about reason, right? The role that
Well,
that plays in being free. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see.
so we don't know if this is going to
Yeah.
be, I mean, we know from the title that this is actually going to be the bad sense of freedom. The I I'm stoic because I feel like I am free of all pressures that would force me to have a particular attitude about things. I am skeptical because I feel like I'm free even of the very facts themselves about my environment that seem to impinge themselves on me, right? The Stoic says things are what they are. I admit the facts, but my reaction is entirely up to me. The skeptic goes further, even things being what they are. Well, I could doubt them. I could, so I, it, both of these are not a matter of reason responsiveness. They are a matter of spinning out in a void that is improperly constrained. Whereas we know that then the Kantian and probably Hegelian good model of freedom is going to be what you're saying, is going to be like, no, hooking my identification and autonomy, you know, as connected with reasons.
Yeah.
For to think does not mean an abstract I,
Does
but
not mean to be an abstract.
to be an abstract I, but an I which has at the same time the significance of intrinsic being, of having itself for object, or of relating itself to objective being in such a way that its significance is the being for self of the consciousness for which it is an object. For in
All right.
thinking, yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Um, right, does not mean to be an abstract I. In other words, it doesn't mean there's such a thing as personal identity at this point. It's not just a Fichtean abstract I collective consciousness thinking. It's me, and furthermore, the lack of abstractness comes from the self relation, this reflexive relation where I take my own consciousness for an object. I think that's basically the. Does that make sense?
Its significance is the being for self of the consciousness for which it is an object.
So this, again, this master slave dyad, which ultimately becomes a reciprocal mutual consciousness, is um, internalized, and in a way, right, we become the reflection upon which we depend comes from ourselves, right? The mirror has been internalized, as I said. So the consciousness for which it is an object, right? The being for self.
So the Lord's intrinsic being for self, oh, they have it all together and they are seeing something of me. Therefore, I am also being for self. Right?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think Lord and bondsman are inside me, if that's even a correct way of speaking, because I think we've reached the point of reciprocity, but there's a dyad here of um, the one who's being recognized by an other and the other, but it's just a fantasized other now, internal
Sure.
to
Yeah.
me, and that's how I'm self-conscious. I'm not self-conscious by going, oh hey, look, there's Wes. I'm self-conscious by having the fantasy of some other consciousness being aware of me, and so I am an object for that consciousness, and you know my intrinsic being is a matter of this internal fantasized consciousness, right? Being a being for self. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's a little. It's still unclear to me, but um,
Well, I like your emphasis of the fantastical nature of it because it does. I mean, of course, we don't know what somebody else actually sees us as or that they have their shit together. And in fact, in this case, we're saying the Lord actually is more like an animal because the Lord has not reached any limits, has not had to say, this is me, this is not me, because his power seems to be absolute. He can just reach through anything. And he's not actually out in the fields trying to like turn grain into bread or something like that. You have to bring it in from the fields. So he's not running into these concrete resistances. So yeah, if the bondsman is going to still see, oh, that Lord is really being for self and really has it together, like no, that's not true. Uh, so yeah, it actually starts as internal. It's not that it is an external thing that is internalized. It is purely a fantasy, which means, yeah, you could actually develop a sense of self against an actual animal or against just an idea like God that like, oh, or, what society in some abstract sense thinks of me.
yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I'm still just trying to parse this. Okay, so relating itself to objective being. Um, Having itself for an object, of relating itself to objective being. Is he talking about objects there?
Like relating myself in opposition to the materials I'm working on.
Yeah,
That's
something
the
like that.
objective being. Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah,
that
it's
works.
possible. Um, in such a way that its significance, and then we have to figure out what its refers to, objective being or consciousness.
No, I think consciousness.
Um, but again, right, he was saying that the substance of these objects, of these fashioned objects, is consciousness. He's already said that. So, such a way that, if we were to read it as these um, objective being significance is the being for self of the consciousness for which it is an object. I think he is actually talking about fashioned objects still here.
Okay.
Um, but
Well,
but
we
we
should
were
say
also
that
talking about
the
self
translator added some
consciousness
words here.
having its. Sorry.
Just that,
Sure. Sure.
yes, that if folks are looking at the text, the significance is the being for self of the consciousness for which it is. That's the end of the sentence. And the translator put an object for which it is an object, just to like, you're not going to
Help
understand
us. Yeah.
this unless, but it is a
Yeah.
guess on his part.
But there's, the thing that's confusing to me here is, okay, this is a restatement in a way of something he's already said, and it's very important because it's not just as Kant said that when we relate to objective being to external objects as appearances, right? We're relating to the categories of our own mind. Or maybe he is saying that that the substance of that external um, thing is in a sense our consciousness in the sense it's constructed. All right. So maybe that is just a very Kantian thing to say. But he's also talking about consciousness as an object. And so are we meant to think about consciousness on analogy to what's been fashioned? Right. Now we take our own consciousness as our own creation, as our own fashioning, and say that so this is very speculative on my part, but it's only the result of me being confused about um, when is he talking about these fashioned objects, and then when is he talking about consciousness as an object? Anyway, I think
Sure,
hopefully
there's
this will.
definite reification, substantification of consciousness here. If we want to say consciousness is an object, like I was saying, you have consciousness. That rock does not have consciousness. Um, so there's something, but I just think about how Descartes treats this, where like there's the thoughts and there's the me that is the thinking thing. And the thoughts are actually the modes of this substance, which is the me that is the thinking thing. And there's something transcendental about the thinker. So is the thinking, when we want to say the world is broken up on Cartesian metaphysics into mind and matter, is the mind just the thoughts themselves? It's the GUI that's or is it the spirits, the thinking things, the objects? Like we never actually encounter, we just infer from oh, there are thoughts, therefore there must be an I that is having the thoughts. So again, this is why for Kant it's a transcendental I. It is not technically a part of experience. I don't know that Descartes fully realizes this point in what he's making. So there definitely is a making this transcendental source of thought into an object, and
Yeah,
making
and
these slippery things, thoughts, into objects as well.
what's important here, right? For Kant, you couldn't just make consciousness an object.
Right.
It was a metaphysical supposition. It's outside of the categories. It's not constructed in the same way, and it's just a bare representation, right? The I think, and I think Hegel wants us to go farther. So we've already gotten the analogy of, right. We have a few different parallels here. One is the Kantian construction of objects via categories of reason and space and time and all that. So of consciousness imprints itself on things, and that's how they become things for us. And then we get the analogy of the art object or the product of work, where the imprinting, right, is more obvious and socially determined and direct. And then we get what happens when consciousness itself becomes an object. When I take my consciousness as an object of consciousness. And then it seems here Hegel seems to be thinking that we do in a sense, right, have knowledge of it in the way that Kant denied, and then in having knowledge of it, we we are finding consciousness on the subjective side in the reified consciousness object, right? And analogy to the way we um, have objects of cognition for Kant. So the next line, for in thinking, the object does not present itself in picture thoughts, but in notions, that is, in a distinct being in itself or intrinsic being. Consciousness being immediately aware that this is not anything distinct from itself. Um, what is pictured or figuratively conceived, what immediately is, has, as such, the form of being something other than consciousness. But a notion is also something that immediately is, and this distinction, insofar as it is present in consciousness itself, is its determinate content. All right, I'm going to stop at the semicolon because the sentence just goes on and on and on.
I mean,
But
I
yeah,
don't think Frege would agree that the notion is merely consciousness itself. Like, no, that was the whole point, is that when you think of something, then you're actually grasping, even if you're just thinking of, we were saying the notion is a blueprint. So it's the idea of something, the essence of something. When I think of a unicorn, when I think of even a cat, it doesn't have to be an imaginary thing. When I think of a triangle, then I am grasping something that is not, that I do not see as merely identical with my grasping, with the consciousness. I see it as an objective content that you could think about too, that I could think about later, that is transcendent.
sure. Yeah, I mean, so this first sentence, he's talking about concepts, right? And it so he's and it when we think of objects, when we have concepts of objects, it's not just picture thoughts, and that is a very Wittgensteinian type of point. We're
Yep.
not just doing our concept of representation cannot be that simplistic, where we just create pictures of the objects. We're thinking about them in notions, right? And in these abstract concepts, which um, don't get fleshed out except in use, essentially. But in any case, and the notion itself, right? He wants to say has an intrinsic being, is a being in itself. Consciousness being
Yep.
immediately aware that is not anything distinct from itself. And I think what is the point he's trying to make there? I mean, I think the point is that we don't think that the concept well, it sounds like he's saying something very un-Hegelian. We don't think the concept is out there in the world. We understand, right? We don't think the concept is part of the represented object. That's
Right.
not
He's
our
not a
natural
Platonist like
inclination,
Frege
but
is.
we think of it as internal to consciousness. So when I'm using the word dog um, and have that concept, I don't think there's a free floating abstraction dog running around in the world. I understand that as something purely a matter of consciousness. Now does sound quite un-Hegelian, and maybe he's just talking about a certain phase here. I'm not sure.
Well,
But
yeah, I mean the fact that it sounds like he's contradicting himself with that the concept is distinct being in itself or intrinsic being, but at the same time, I'm aware that it's not anything distinct from the thinking from itself. Uh, so maybe it's just a nominalist. I mean that this is the character that this is why Frege seems so freaky to people, because he sounds like a Platonist, that there really
right,
are thoughts out in some ontology that we grasp, and no, that's we create them as objects, as distinct things to consider, but we know that they're thoughts. uh, what is pictured or figuratively conceived, what immediately is, has as such the form of being of something other than consciousness, but a notion is also something that immediately is. And this distinction, insofar as it's present in consciousness itself, is its determinate content.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's leave it there for a second. Right. So what is pictured? I think he's talking about the intentional object now.
Hmm.
Um, that has the form of being something other than consciousness. That's the out there. What is pictured as opposed to what we're picturing. Unfortunately, he's now talking about concept formation as picturing, which he's just said it's not really, but we can we can understand why these the words that we use like representation. But what is pictured, the intentional object, uh, has the form of being something other than consciousness, which is to say, it just points outward, right? We somehow have this. We somehow know that the concept is consciousness, is internal to consciousness, but what it's pointing to is outside of consciousness, is other than consciousness. But a notion is also something that is immediately is, right, in its own right. And this distinction, insofar as present in consciousness itself, is its determinate content. So this distinction between concept and object is part of the content of consciousness.
Well, could I present an alternate interpretation, which is in the
Yeah.
previous sentence, in thinking, the object does not present itself in picture thoughts, but in notions. And then in this sentence, what is pictured or figuratively conceived. So, in other words, he's saying there is something in phenomenology that is having a picture thought. It's just that's not thinking. To think is actually, but you can just have images run through your mind. That's maybe what we're doing when we're daydreaming, when there's what is pictured or figuratively conceived, what immediately is has as such the form of being other than consciousness. But so as soon as you sort of focus on a picture, then you actually do see it as uh, an object. It immediately is right in my consciousness, and has the form of something other than consciousness. That it is an image of, even if it's an image of green, but more likely it's an image of a dog, and a dog presents itself as like, oh, there is this concept dog, and there are real dogs in the world. So is he really just brushing away in that first sentence the idea of picturing that he is Wittgenstein, and so all the mental is not picturing, or is he contrasting picture thoughts and notions in both these sentences?
Yeah, and then my interpretation is just that um, we, even though the concept is not a picture, we, he could be saying what is right. So if we were speaking about the distinction between intuition and understanding and Kant, understanding would be
Yes.
the locus of concepts, and intuition would be the locus of, in a sense, what we picture, immediate apprehension of objects in our environment, which does feel a lot like uh, picturing. We're not only just using concepts, but we have this intuitive gestalt access to the world around us. So we might be talking about sense perception and intuition in the picturing part, and that's what seems to be other than consciousness. So in other words, we're just getting a distinction here, possibly between the understanding and intuition, and where the we do have this right. We have this very important idea that we are relating to something outside of us, and we're not just relating to our own internal concepts, but there are these internal concepts. So we can conceive of it as, of course, as a relationship between concepts and intuitions, as Kant did.
All right.
All right, but a notion is also something that immediately is, and this distinction, insofar as it is present in consciousness itself, is its determinate content. All right, we already mentioned that. But since this content is at the same time a content grasped in thought, consciousness remains immediately aware of its unity with this determinate and distinct being, not, as in the case of a picture thought, where consciousness still has specially to bear in mind that this is its picture thought. On the contrary, the notion is for me straight away my notion. So I think here the idea is whereas I understand my interpretation may be wrong, but just as propedeutic, as a way of understanding, I think while we understand that with intuitions we don't feel identical with the objects in our intuitions, we automatically make this distinction. Um, when it comes to concepts, there is a special sense of unity between my consciousness and the concept.
Yeah, I don't like this uh, sentiment that for a picture, consciousness has to still bear in mind that it is its picture thought. In other words, the picture uh, presents itself as being of something transcendent or whatever, and I have to keep in mind that, like, oh no, it's actually just me picturing that. On a concept, the notion is straight away my notion. Whereas actually, I think it might be the opposite, that if something is merely an image, is merely a picture for me, then it doesn't present itself as right. If I'm daydreaming and it's just an image without reference to the outside, then I don't have to keep in mind that it's my image, like that it is presented as part of the soup of my daydream, if you like this analogy. Uh, Whereas a notion, it does not present itself as my notion. It presents itself, as Frege says, as something objective that I'm understanding, that I'm grasping. Uh, all right, so let's go with what he's saying. That the notion is for me straight away my notion. In thinking, I am free because I am not an other, but remain simply and solely in communication with myself. And the object, which is for me the essential being, is an undivided unity, my being for myself. And my activity in conceptual thinking is a movement within myself.
Okay. All right. So this is interesting because he's trying to use this now to flesh out the notion of freedom. I'm free
Mm-hmm.
because I'm not in an other, but remain in communion with myself. And the object, which for me is the essential being, is an undivided unity. Wait, is in undivided
Yep.
unity, my being for myself. The
I think
object,
this
which
is
is
just
immediate, is
Descartes.
in. Um, um, yeah, still
I'm
not understanding.
I'm just seeing this whole thing as describing the phenomenology of Descartes in his initial moment. I thinking creates this sphere that, like, yeah, there are things that are represent external things, but we don't know if there really are external things. That I'm merely in communication with myself, insofar as I'm merely thinking, I'm churning around ideas. And so the object, my thoughts, are not, as Hegel normally says, immediately transcendent. That of course, if I'm thinking of something, there must be an object, there must be a world that I'm engaging with. And that's why skepticism doesn't actually make any sense fundamentally. Here he's playing in the Cartesian space. I am merely in relation with myself when I'm thinking.
Yeah. So this makes sense. The object is my being for myself. I
Yep.
take my self consciousness as my object, and that's the essential being. And so um, thinking is completely a movement within myself at this point of self consciousness because it's not a relation to an external object. It's just consciousness's relationship to itself, or self consciousness's relationship to itself as an object. And in that there is freedom, um, because I'm just in myself, right? I'm not in the reflection of another or
Yep.
the internalized fantasy of a reflection of another. Okay.
It is essential, however, in thus characterizing this shape of self-consciousness, to bear firmly in mind that it is thinking consciousness in general, that its object is an immediate unity of being in itself and being for itself. The self-same consciousness that repels itself from itself becomes aware of itself as an element of being in itself, as the element of being in itself. But at first, it knows itself to be this element only as a universal mode of being in general, not as it exists objectively in the development and process of its manifold being.
Okay.
I think
So
it's
that
saying
was all
that
clear. We can just skip that. I'm just kidding.
well, yeah, that Descartes is the Fichtean. That he is that when you're in this moment of I'm complete solipsism of only all my thoughts are just relating myself to myself, then you are not distinguishing yourself as it's the specific West that is having this thought, right?
Yeah.
You are consciousness as a universal.
Yeah. So this fun and free relationship that self-consciousness can have to itself, as pictured here, is yeah, according to the Fichtean critique, can only be at this general level, not at the level of personal identity. And then the self-same consciousness that repels itself from itself becomes aware of itself as the element of being in itself. Um, we've stated the general point, but I just don't understand this part of it. Aware of itself as the element of being in itself. But at first, it knows it's to be only a universal mode of being in general, um, not as it exists objectively in the development and process of its manifold being. So he's foreshadowing something different than the Fichtean general self consciousness.
So in repelling itself from itself, in other words, I'm thinking thoughts and I have an ambivalence to these thoughts. They are part of me. You know, everything is a part of me at this point, but they're also not the thinker. The thinker and the thoughts are separate. You know that the thinker is thinking the thoughts. So there is a that's I think that's the repulsion that I'm in considering myself this self-enclosed world. I'm still creating an object. I'm still distinguishing the noesis, the consciousness side from the noema, whichever I
Mm.
don't remember which one is which, but one is the object and one is the subject. So
Noema is the object. Yeah.
yeah, okay, you're right. And I create through this idea the idea that the system as a whole, consciousness is being in itself. It is a substance, right? So why say I'm a thinking thing? Well, it's because I have thingified by conceiving this whole thing through my own opposition of my thoughts. That's my
Right.
best guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. We get we get a self, right. So at first we seem to be entirely within, there doesn't seem to be a subject object distinction, in other words, because it's just subject taking subject.
Mm-hmm.
But the structure of that is subject object. One is repelled from the other, so that um, then my concept of myself or my self consciousness gets imbued with the sense that there's an otherness involved, but only in general, not in the more social, right? Not objectively in the development and process of its manifold being, right? Not, in other words, not in social terms, not in developmental terms, not in this terms of the process of recognition that he describes.
The thing that was tripping me up when I was trying to trying to rehearse that is, okay, we've created the idea of objectivity in just thinking that the thoughts are the objects, you know, or I'm thinking of a dog, and therefore the picture image or the notion of dog isn't becomes an object in there. But he says the self-same consciousness that repels itself becomes aware of itself as the element of being in itself. So what I just described was the idea of thinking, of objectifying something within my mind, creates objects. That is being in itself. But he's saying, I'm aware in doing this, I'm aware of myself as being in itself, which is taking it a step further. It's doing what Descartes does and saying, oh, this whole thing proves that I am a self, am a thinking thing. I am being in itself. But I'm not actually sure how you get that conclusion out of the primordial experience of the contents of consciousness of the noema.
Right. Yep. I think
All right,
that's
and
clarifying. Yeah.
people have wondered. It says Stoicism in the title of the episode here. Let's read 198, which is very short, and we'll actually get a mention of Stoicism before we stop here.
This freedom of self-consciousness, when it appeared as a conscious manifestation in the history of spirit, has, as we know, been called Stoicism. We've been talking a lot about Descartes, but here we are with Stoicism already. Its principle is that consciousness is a being that thinks, and that consciousness holds something to be essentially important or true and good only insofar as it thinks it to be such. All right, so the Stoic principle at stake here is that, nothing is good or bad in itself. Thinking makes it so. All right, there's the preferable and the not preferable, but good and bad only happen at the level of one's own virtue, one's own character, one's own comportment to the world, and that we can control our emotional responses to the world because we can control our thoughts, and those responses follow on our thoughts.
And I don't know how I learned this, but Descartes is a Stoic, was a Stoic. That is insofar he's not really that interested in ethics, and he doesn't write very much about it. But what we know about it is that yeah, this is not a giant leap from talking about Descartes' reflection on himself to jumping to the ethical applications. It's a leap that Descartes himself made. He saw Stoicism as the
Hmm.
natural ethics, given his I know that whenever, as everybody does in the literature, characterizes Descartes as this fundamental point of doubt, then you are quick to say, well, that's of course Descartes not his not ultimate conclusion. Like he thinks that the external world does exist. We really, there is a God. There is a whole transcendental world that imposes itself upon us. That we are not really free to doubt anything. Skepticism is ultimately resolvable, and so you think that Stoicism itself would not be a permanent position to end on either. That there really are, if there's a God that is the best possible thing, right? It is not just a creator God. It is an ethically charged, an ethically creative, and ethically empowered God. Then there really are things that are good or bad for us. It's not just thinking that makes it so.
Yeah. The freedom here, right? If good and bad are really out there in the world, then we are subject to them, right? So if it's bad
Mm-hmm.
in it, if it's genuinely bad that my wife dies, then my happiness is entirely dependent on that. And I have no control over that. And the Stoic wants to say my happiness is dependent on nothing but me and my thoughts. There's a kind of lack of freedom in the good and bad being out there. We become subject to them. But if the good and bad are all inside and under our control, then we have true freedom. It's a little tricky here because he'll say consciousness holds something to be essentially important or true and good only insofar as it thinks it to be such. The Stoics aren't relativists, right, in that way. They just want to, I mean, and Hegel isn't either, but it sounds like something a relativist would say. There is
Mm-hmm.
no good or bad in itself.
Or
The Stoic,
true.
there is good and bad in its, or sorry, true, right? Truth too. Good point. We're talking about both the ethical and the epistemological here at once. But just focusing on the good here with Stoicism, Stoics do think that there is an intrinsically good thing. It just happens to be um, internal to us. So it's not, Hegel is technically right in this formulation, right? It's only good insofar as it thinks it to be such, but that doesn't mean that it's up to us. Um, it's just a matter of our, right. There really are some things are virtuous and some things are not. And that's not up to us.
Right.
All
And of
right. Are
course,
we,
there's the
yeah.
distinction between Epictetus Stoicism, which is, I think, where that, nothing's good or bad, but thinking makes it so, except virtue. That should actually be appended to Epictetus's. Uh, but even that, it's like we recognize there's a sort of course guard, sort of the reason that we know that virtue, what is virtuous is in fact virtuous, is in fact good, is because of the way it makes us feel, because of the way. So it really is sort of built into human nature. It is not, whereas Marcus Aurelius has more of a Confucian, like the whole universe is ordered and it is whatever happens was supposed to happen, fate, and you should have amor fati. You should align yourself so there is an objective thing that you should do. And I was sort of imposing that on Descartes' idea of like, yes, God actually is good and has something to do with the ethical order. Uh, therefore, yeah, I'm just not sure how whether that would lead a Cartesian Stoic as unmoored from good or evil as the Epictetus version appears to be, right? The Epictetus version does appear to be some sort of relativist. It just happens to be that insofar as you have a speck of virtue in you, insofar as you are, I think the Epictetus, you could ask the same sort of questions of like, how Epictetus do you know what virtue is? Well, it's because I'm a virtuous person and I recognize in my equanimity, right? It is relaxing to me to not worry about too many things, to only worry about my own virtue, to not stress about the fact that fate could take away my wife or any of my possessions at any point. But what if somebody just doesn't share those sentiments at all? How do you prove to them that they're objective
Yeah.
good? You would have to, it's the same, any other sort of
Right. It's the same
empiricist.
normative problem. You have to
Yeah.
appeal to human constitution. And I think
Hmm.
the Stoics would. Right. So it's not up to us what's virtuous and what's not. It depends on our human constitution.
But there might be just no way. Like, I think they're pretty much fatalistic about irredeemable people. Uh, at least I thought I remembered Epictetus being not so much like everybody can be a Stoic. No, it's the chosen few that have reason in ascendance and that have self-control can be Stoic. Anybody can sort of voyage a little further on that road, but there might be some people that just do not actually have that constitution, that they're going to be able to not worry about stuff. And even if they did, they wouldn't necessarily get the benefits that we, the virtuous Stoics, get out of it.
Hmm. All right. Are we out of time?
I think we are. So are you, should we say
Yes.
we want to do
Yeah,
more of
no,
this?
I
Okay.
thoroughly enjoyed this. Yeah.
All right. So we will start next time on section 199 on page 121. Thanks for hanging out with us. Yes. So this is posting on the public Closereads feed. You're not going to hear part two, as you should know by now. There'll be weeks that'll go by with nothing else popping up in this feed. So you have to go and subscribe via patreon.com/close philosophy if you want to get subsequent parts of this. That's just what we got to do to make it worth our time. We'd love to share everything freely with the world, but that's the way it is. Hey, if that doesn't piss you off too much, please go to the Close Reads Apple podcast page and leave a nice 5-star rating and review. Otherwise, just be respectfully silent.
All
Thanks.
right.
Bye.
Thank you.